Evan Mercer had spent years saving lives, but no one in Ridgeton expected the town's most trusted firefighter to become the man who would bring the entire police department to its knees in a single night. Evan Mercer's life looked perfectly steady from the outside, the kind of routine that made neighbors confident he would always be the first to help in a crisis. For years, he carried a reputation built on discipline and calm judgment. People waved at him when he returned from long shifts, and children in the neighborhood admired his uniform. Yet behind the polite smiles and quiet lifestyle, he was struggling with a pressure that grew heavier each day. It started with small, easily dismissed moments, subtle shifts in his home, faint noises late at night, and tiny details he couldn't quite put together. What bothered him most was how these incidents repeated without explanation. Shoes he left near the door ended up facing the opposite direction. His backyard gate was often unlatched even though he remembered securing it carefully. At first, he told himself these were simply signs of exhaustion from working too many hours, but over time the patterns became too specific to ignore. Evan began paying close attention to his surroundings. He checked the windows twice before going to bed and inspected the locks on his truck each morning. Nothing ever appeared broken or damaged, yet something always felt slightly off. The sense of being observed developed slowly, creeping into his thoughts until it became impossible to shake. When his mailbox started showing signs of forced opening without any mail inside, the unease turned into suspicion. He wondered whether someone was trying to access personal documents or track his movements. The idea seemed irrational at first, but it stuck in his mind like a seed that kept growing. The turning point came when he noticed repeated entries in emergency dispatch logs listing his address as the source of various calls. None of them were made by him, and the times didn't match any activity on his end. Evan stared at the records for hours, trying to understand how such mistakes could happen more than once. To him, the explanation felt too deliberate to be simple system errors. The more he analyzed the logs, the more he believed that someone had intentionally routed false reports using his information. The thought unsettled him deeply. As the days passed, Evan withdrew into himself. He stopped spending time with coworkers, avoided casual conversations, and went straight home after shifts to study subtle changes in and around his house. His mind filled with theories, each more troubling than the last. He didn't share his concerns with anyone, fearing that people might think he was overreacting. Instead, he convinced himself that staying alert was the only way to protect his reputation and safety. By now he felt cornered, convinced that pressure was building around him. The quiet firefighter who once carried confidence into every emergency was slowly consumed by a fear he couldn't prove but couldn't ignore either. Evan's investigation began quietly, almost unnoticed, as if he were slipping into a different version of himself without realizing it. He started with the simplest step, listening. Each night, after returning from his shift, he sat in his dimly lit living room with the police scanner turned low. At first, he listened only out of curiosity, but soon he began memorizing dispatches, patrol numbers, and timing patterns. He paid attention to which officers stayed on routine paths and which ones changed their routes unexpectedly. He convinced himself these details were clues, although nothing actually pointed toward him. At the fire station, Evan's behavior shifted in ways no one questioned because he hid it behind offers to take on more responsibility. He volunteered for late-night coverage and extra cleanup tasks, using the opportunity to collect discarded equipment, old radios with cracked screens, damaged helmets, and broken communication units. He took them home under the pretense of salvaging parts, but privately he saw them as pieces of a puzzle he believed he needed to solve. By arranging and testing the devices, he felt he was one step closer to understanding the forces he imagined were closing in on him. His notebook became the center of his world. He filled page after page with lists of names, suspecting certain officers of monitoring him. He jotted down dates, weather conditions, and even the direction patrol cars faced when parked near the downtown area. Every entry added weight to his belief that someone inside the police department had singled him out. His notes grew so detailed that he began carrying the notebook everywhere, tucked inside his coat like a shield. As his suspicions intensified, Evan adjusted his daily routines. He avoided streets where patrol cars frequently passed and changed routes to and from work without following any clear pattern. He drove slowly at night, watching for headlights in his rearview mirror, convinced that even an ordinary vehicle could be part of a hidden operation. The world around him no longer felt familiar. Each shadow carried meaning, each quiet moment felt staged. Late one evening, he noticed a patrol car parked near his corner for the third time in a week. The officer inside wasn't looking at him, wasn't interacting with anything nearby, but Evan interpreted the presence as confirmation of everything he had feared. It didn't matter that the car was likely there for routine surveillance. In his mind, the message was clear. From that moment forward, his investigation stopped being about understanding and became about preparing. He believed that whatever was happening was far bigger than a misunderstanding. He believed the entire department was involved. And with that belief solidified, Evan's next steps moved towards something irreversible. Evan's grip on reality weakened the night he noticed a vehicle trailing him along a long stretch of highway. The car didn't behave unusually, didn't speed up or slow down in a suspicious way. But Evan's mind had already built a framework where nothing was coincidence. When the vehicle eventually turned off into a different neighborhood, the relief he felt didn't calm him. Instead, it pushed him toward a conclusion he had been avoiding, that this was only the beginning of a larger plan against him. The fear that had lived quietly in the back of his mind now grew into something sharp and consuming. He believed he was running out of time. Over the next few days, Evan rewired his entire life around a single idea. He needed to act before someone else did. He studied the police station from a distance, observing which doors were used most often and noting the times lights turned on and off inside the building. He drove past the station at different hours, never slowing down enough to draw attention but always watching closely. Each small observation became part of a mental blueprint. He rehearsed possible scenarios in his head, adjusting them again and again until they felt flawless. His thinking no longer followed normal logic. Everything was filtered through the belief that he was a target. Evan's training as a firefighter made him painfully aware of vulnerabilities in buildings and emergency systems. He knew where smoke alarms were usually placed, how backup generators worked, and how quickly confusion could spread when people were forced to respond without preparation. These skills had once saved lives, but now they shaped a plan built on mistrust. He collected old tools from storage units at the firehouse, carefully choosing items that wouldn't immediately be missed. Heavy pry bars, outdated flare guns, and worn protective gear found their way into the back of his truck. He didn't see this as arming himself. He saw it as gathering resources he believed he needed for survival. As the plan formed, Evan's emotional state changed from fear to determination. He stopped questioning whether his assumptions were correct. In his mind, the danger was real and immediate, and he viewed himself as the only one capable of stopping it. He avoided people at work, gave short answers, and spent breaks sitting alone in the firehouse garage, reviewing his notes and memorizing every detail. His once reliable calmness had disappeared, replaced by a steady, cold focus that concerned no one because he hid it behind silence. On the final night before he acted, Evan parked his truck behind an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. He sat there for nearly an hour, staring at the faint glow of the police station in the distance. Instead of uncertainty, he felt a strange sense of clarity. In his mind, stepping forward meant taking control. He believed the moment had arrived, and he was ready to carry out the plan he thought would protect him from a threat that existed only in the shadows of his imagination. Evan approached the police station with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every step in silence. The night was cold, and a thin layer of fog blurred the edges of the parking lot lights, creating the perfect cover he believed he needed. He parked several blocks away and moved on foot, carrying only the tools he had taken from the firehouse. His breathing stayed steady, his steps slow and controlled, as if he were responding to an emergency rather than creating one. In his mind, he wasn't acting out of aggression but out of necessity, convinced that this was the only way to stop the invisible threat closing around him. He began by disabling the outer lights. Using a rescue tool normally meant for cutting through collapsed structures, he carefully reached the electric box behind the storage shed and severed key wires. Parts of the lot fell into darkness, leaving officers inside unaware that anything unusual had happened. Evan then positioned old flare guns in hidden corners and activated makeshift timers that would fire the flares upward at unpredictable intervals. The bright bursts would create confusion, pulling attention away from the station and toward the sky. The first flare streaked upward a few minutes later, casting red light across the lot and triggering immediate alert responses inside the building. While the officers scrambled to understand the sudden disturbance, Evan moved along the back wall of the station toward the garage. He knew the layout, knew the weaknesses, and used a heavy pry bar to force open a side door that rarely saw use. Inside, the garage was quiet except for the hum of idle vehicles. He worked quickly, targeting the essential components of each patrol car: battery cables, radios, ignition wiring. Years of emergency training had taught him how to dismantle things safely and efficiently, and now those skills were used to disable nearly every vehicle in minutes. To him, this was a protective measure, preventing what he believed would be a coordinated attempt to capture him. Outside, more flares burst, lighting the sky in chaotic flashes. Officers ran back and forth, attempting to track the source of the distress signals. Evan had also programmed old radios to send out bursts of static and fragmented emergency codes, adding another layer of confusion. Dispatchers struggled to separate real calls from false ones, and the entire department's response system became overwhelmed. The station, usually organized and prepared for anything, now felt unbalanced and frantic. Evan stepped back into the shadows and surveyed everything with an eerie sense of satisfaction. He believed he had disrupted the conspiracy before it could harm him. The chaos unfolding across the station felt like proof that his fears had been real all along. He remained hidden, observing the officers who ran in circles trying to regain control. What they saw as an attack, he viewed as a necessary act of self-defense. In that moment, he felt certain he had taken the only path available, unaware that each action pushed him deeper into a world shaped not by reality, but by his own unraveling thoughts. Evan stepped into the open only when the chaos he created reached its peak. Patrol cars sat disabled in the garage, flares still burned across the pavement, and officers tried to make sense of the conflicting radio signals. For the first time that night, he walked without urgency, moving into the center of the blinking lights as if he belonged there. The officers who noticed him froze for a moment, stunned by the sight of the firefighter they had trusted for years standing calmly amid the disruption. His face showed no panic, only a strange, quiet relief, as though he had finally finished something that had weighed on him for too long. He didn't hide, run, or resist. He simply stopped moving, waiting for whatever happened next. When he was taken into custody, Evan didn't attempt to explain himself. Investigators soon searched his home and uncovered the full extent of the obsession that had consumed him. Notebooks filled with dense notes covered entire walls of his living room. Maps with lines drawn between ordinary locations made it look as though he had been tracking a complex operation. Old radios, damaged scanners, and piles of unused emergency equipment lay scattered across his floor. To an outside observer, the objects appeared meaningless, but to Evan they had been vital pieces of a system he believed he needed to decipher. Every detail revealed how deeply he had slipped into a world created entirely by his own fears. As detectives pieced together his actions, it became clear that none of the threats he believed in had ever existed. The false dispatch calls linked to his address were the result of software errors that went unreported. The patrol car parked near his street was part of a routine rotation covering multiple neighborhoods. The mail issues and broken window latch had simple explanations that anyone else might have dismissed, but Evan's mind had magnified each small event until it became part of a grand conspiracy only he could see. His carefully constructed plan, built over weeks, was based entirely on illusions that felt real to him but had no foundation in reality. In the days that followed, the town struggled to understand how their trusted firefighter had reached such a breaking point without anyone noticing. The police department repaired its damaged vehicles and rewrote portions of its response protocols to prevent similar confusion in the future, but the emotional impact lingered far longer than the physical repairs. Residents who once greeted Evan warmly now spoke of him in quiet, uncertain tones, unsure whether to view him as a villain or a man lost to his own unraveling mind. Evan remained calm through every interview and evaluation, convinced even afterward that he had acted correctly. His sense of relief never faded, as though the collapse of everything around him had finally eased the pressure inside his thoughts. For the community, his downfall became a story marked not by malice, but by a quiet descent, unnoticed until it was too late. The night he turned against the police department stayed in local memory as a reminder that even those who seem the strongest can silently lose their way, and that danger sometimes comes from the person no one would ever suspect.